Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. Let me know how the audio is in the chat. I've got the chat up. I'll just let you introduce yourself. I don't know your name. It's Mouthy Infidel, I think is your channel, but
Yep. My name's Ethan. I have a YouTube channel called Mouthy Infidel where I just kind of often make prepared content about various issues, debate people, and so on. That's just, yeah, I guess that's the kind of thing that I generally like to do on my channel.
cool. And you had a debate a while back. You said your views might have changed since then. You had a capital, or I think it's like a communism versus capitalism debate. And I went through that
Yep.
debate. I made it through about halfway, and I was just looking for chinks in your argument. Basically, you want to give some background on how you and I came to be having this conversation?
Yeah, I guess I saw some of your content that you talked about socialism. I saw your video about Richard Wolff. I saw your debate with Vosh, the debate you moderated between Vosh and Sargon, and so on. And I just thought I generally enjoy your content, and I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation with you. So I reached out to you on Twitter, and you responded. And so I guess here we are.
Yeah, totally. So you saw some of the. Do you have any thoughts on the Sargon uh, Vosh debate?
Yeah, I think that obviously, and I even talked to Vasha a little bit after the debate. I think his optics could have been a little better, and he agrees. But I generally think that he did pretty good on the substance. And, I do think that I saw Sargon using some tactics that I thought were a little bit deflective and so on. So, but yeah, I guess I thought it was pretty entertaining. I thought that they got bogged down a lot, like on very small issues, like when they debated like the definition of what far right was for like an hour. I
I
thought that
know.
was like, yeah,
I did like the fact that Vosh did a stream where he was reflective on the debate, which I think is good. the, we're all a work in progress, so learning on our feet is
yeah,
kind of
absolutely,
the best way to go. So
yep.
on the substance, I guess we are ultimately going. You wanted to focus in on worker co-ops, which I think is the majority really of the debate between capitalism and socialism, or socialism and communism. So I
Yes, yep.
I have about 6 questions, and you're welcome to ask me questions too. Maybe I'll just go first since I have mine written out.
Yeah, absolutely.
That could possibly establish your position. So
Yep.
my first question is innovation important, and how important is it to you?
Yeah, I think innovation is extremely important, and I think it's one of the most important things that you need in order to form a successful society. So yeah, I would say that innovation is one of the most important things for me.
Okay, so very important. Uh, and what is your position, your pro worker co-ops position based on? What are you looking at that's convinced you that worker co-ops are better than capitalist uh, industry?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So let me just like lay this out a little bit. This might be I hope I don't take too long
No,
doing
take
this,
your
but yeah,
time.
just let me lay out why I think that capitalism is not a system which is uh, working so well in the present moment, and why I think that socialism is the right way to go. So I guess I think three of like the primary contradictions within capitalism, or the primary issues with capitalism, and I take this derive this point a little bit from Richard Wolff. I guess the three major things with capitalism in the present day are, for one, capitalism breeds incredible inequality. For two, it breeds incredible instability, and for three, it's inherently undemocratic. So for the first part, inequality, I think Oxfam tracks the statistics, and I think maybe the most recent stat was like the top like 3 or 4 people in America own as much wealth as like the bottom half of the population. We see capitalism just breeding an incredible amount of inequality, and this inequality, rather than or aside from just being on its face an inefficient allocation of resources, when we have 70% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck and half of workers earning $30,000 a year or less, while people have more wealth than they know what to do with. Like, I think that's in itself a misallocation.
I'm just curious. I hate to interrupt, but why do you say that's inefficient? Because the flip side of that would be this is more efficient because those people are not going to be innovators in society. So therefore, the argument would be made you need to give more resources to the Elon Musks of the world because they're going to be the ones innovating. You've already said innovation is very, very important, one of the most important things in society.
Yeah, so I guess my counter argument to that claim about we need to give more money to like the richest people so that they can innovate more, I guess I would just disagree. I think that
so you think it's more efficient to give money to everyone, even though those people are not innovators?
Well, hold on. So I think that if you want to say like we need to give more money to the richest people so they can innovate, I guess the question that we would have to ask to kind of see if that argument holds up is, do rich people spend their money on innovation when given money? And I just don't think that's true. I mean, if you look at like the statistics, overwhelmingly when rich people acquire more money, they don't spend it on stuff like research and development. They spend the overwhelming amount on things like stock buybacks and like send billions of dollars into offshore tax havens. So I don't necessarily think that the rich overall is being very productive with their innovation. And in fact, I think if you distribute the wealth more evenly, you will have a lot more people in society who do have the capacity to innovate, who at the present moment just don't have the financial means to really do so. But I think if you spread the wealth more evenly, you will see more people producing innovation.
Yeah, I'm for universal basic income. So, I mean, I agree with you at some level, but when there's certain people in the population that there's like super innovators. So you want to throw as many resources at them as you can, theoretically. So while I don't disagree with you that there is some split, there is a certain number of rich people that are not using their money to innovate. They're basically rent seekers. I don't know that the communist socialist argument makes this distinction and looks for ways to solve this. But just, do you agree with me that there are certain innovators in society that we want to throw resources at because they are these super innovators?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you do have these people who have the capacity to innovate a lot. And I think there's a lot of these people. And that's why I think it's important to distribute the wealth more democratically. So more of these people who do have the capacity to innovate a lot are given that opportunity, which, in, modern capitalist society, they're not. And I do think that it is not just, a few, but the majority of rich people who, on the aggregate, aren't really doing a lot that's productive with their money.
Do you have stats on that? Where are you getting this from?
Yeah, sure. I can find some.
Well, I mean, I don't want you to pull it up now. The question that I asked you originally was, what is your position based on? Which you still haven't really answered. So.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah, to get back to that. So, the reason that I advocate for socialism is because, one, capitalism is incredibly unequal.
Inequality. What was the second
one?
Yeah,
so there's inequality, which, aside from just being a misallocation of resources, also leads to a lot of negative externalities, such as increased crime, decreased social cohesion, and a lot of that stuff, and even lower economic growth. Right. Cool. So also, I would say that instability is another major issue. There are statistics saying that wherever and whenever capitalism has been implemented, there has been an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. and that's in every nation that's ever existed that we have statistics on in every time period. It has an economic downturn. So, and that means people lose their jobs, people lose their businesses, people lose their education. There are long lasting economic effects that we have to experience for years after the downturn. Just a lot of negative externalities comes from that instability.
This is
Sure, go ahead.
this is creative destruction. So you've already said innovation is very important, one of the most important parts of society. The business cycle is based on innovation.
Well, okay, so I would actually disagree with that to a certain extent. I don't think that we do have economic recessions because of innovation. I think that the reason that we have economic recessions is just because of, in general, the irrationality of capitalism. So let me give you an example. So my interpretation of the 2008 economic collapse is.
Let's go to the other one because it's a better example. Let's talk about the one before 2008.
The Great Depression?
No, the dot-com boom. The dot-com boom was driven by innovation. People got overly exuberant about it. So they put more faith in the innovation than was actually should have been put in there. But it's a product of the innovation cycle. Like the dot-com boom was based on innovation, right? I mean, we were finding this new way to deliver products and services via the internet.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so I would disagree. I mean, I don't really know a lot about that specific instance. But when
if you want to go to 2008, the housing boom, the innovation was these securities, which I agree with you that it was a bad innovation, but it was still a over exuberance over some type of innovation. In this case, it was a financial market innovation.
Yes, but the reason that asset-backed securities were such a problem, and it led to such a massive economic downturn when people defaulted on their debts and these asset-backed securities lost all their value. The reason that this happened was because people defaulted on their debts in massive numbers, because ever since the 1970s, we have had stagnant wages, which led to increased borrowing and debt on the part of the working class, which in turn created a situation in which we had a economy in which consumption was based on debt, and the workers didn't have the means to pay off that debt. And when they couldn't pay off that debt, these asset-backed securities essentially exploded and lost all of their value. And that's what I mean is, like, even if I were to grant you that a lot of downturns are simply because of innovations, which I don't necessarily grant that, because I don't think innovations intrinsically cause economic collapse. I think that's largely the case. I think that's how capitalism reacts to. I think perhaps the way in which capitalism as an economic system reacts to innovation causes economic collapse. But we've been having innovation since feudalism, and we've been having innovation in slave society, but we didn't see the same cyclical economic collapse in feudalism or slave society. So perhaps I will grant you that perhaps the specific way in which capitalism reacts to innovation causes economic downturn, but I don't think innovation in itself causes economic downturn. And I think that's all the more reason we should advocate for the abolition of capitalism.
Instability. What was the third one?
Okay, so there's inequality, instability. And then the third thing I would say is that capitalism is intrinsically undemocratic. So this is fairly obvious. So like in any business, or go ahead.
Well, my question was, what is your position based on? So are you basing it on your feelings that inequality disparity is immoral, that
okay, so
undemocratic systems are immoral? Because what are you basing? I asked you what you based your position on.
So so that I was just telling you what my critiques of capitalism were, and to kind of base my position. But I can get deeper and tell you what my ethical or rather normative ethical framework is.
Well, you're still just basing it on your feelings, though. In that case.
Well, I mean, okay, so I'll try to illuminate this as clearly as possible. So I am a utilitarian.
Okay.
I think that the objective purpose of any moral framework is to bring about the maximum amount of happiness, or at least well-being, because happiness is kind of a tricky term.
We're still just talking about your feelings here. So,
I mean, I think that this is pretty logical deducible. I mean, I can run you through the logical deduction. We evolved, and I know you agree with this, we evolved to have morals because it allowed us to survive. So therefore, logically speaking, if we can accept the premise that things should serve the purpose that we developed them to serve, it then logically follows that the purpose of an ethical framework is to maximize well-being. And therefore, we ought to do in society what maximizes well-being.
Okay. We're getting closer. I'm asking you what you're basing your position on. Like, what tangible evidence do you have? I understand that you feel society should be this way. That in your heart of hearts, you feel society is unequal, and more people should be happier. But I'm asking you what there's really two components of the question, I guess. Like what are you basing this conjecture on other than your feelings, and also what are you basing your solutions on?
Okay, so it's a pretty logical deduction, actually, in my opinion. So I think the logical deduction, I'll run you through the premises, and this is the logical deduction I'm basing my views on capitalism and socialism on. A, we ought to do what makes people as well off as possible. Or, okay, actually, let me start.
That's based on your feelings.
I mean, what isn't based on feelings? Like, why do you believe in capitalism? Is it because you think it drives more innovation?
Yeah.
Well, why do you think that's good? Because innovation makes people more well off. Okay, so you're arguing from your feeling that people should be well off. Like, this kind of applies to anything.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, so I guess the logical deduction I'm basing this opinion off of is A, things ought to do what their purpose is. B, the purpose of a moral framework, as per evolution, is to facilitate maximum well-being. C, we should develop, or any moral philosophy we develop, or any normative framework for how society should be that we develop should seek to maximize overall well-being. And D, socialism would maximize well-being more so than capitalism, so therefore we should adopt socialism.
Okay.
And my referencing of the inequality and instability and undemocratic nature of capitalism comes from the fact that I think these things lower the overall well-being of society to an extent which doesn't necessarily have to exist and wouldn't exist if we were to adopt a socialist economy.
So what are you basing that on? You're saying that more people, you're basically making a utilitarian argument where you want more people to have more resources. So
I want more people to be more well off, and I think that very often correlates with allowing people to have more resources.
Correct. So, but the problem is when we lose innovation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we want to sustain innovation at the same time. So these two forces are pulling against one another, correct?
Yes, we do want. Wait. What do you mean pulling against each other?
Well, if we take all the money and distribute it evenly, there are going to be no Elon Musk of the world, because you're not going to be able to pool enough capital to do anything massive. You're not going to be able to build a particle accelerator or a nuclear power plant.
Well, actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, you can still have very large businesses, and if you work for that business, you can contribute and you can innovate. And I would actually think that a socialist economy would create more innovation because more people have the means to innovate. And I mean, so I don't
on a smaller scale, though. None of these people are going to be going to Mars.
Well, why not?
Well, they would be forced to work collectively to go to Mars. I don't. Who would like? I don't understand.
Okay, well, say you're part of a cooperative,
Mm-hmm.
and
Let's
you
move on. Let's
contribute
keep before
something.
we dive in. Let's move more back to the questions because it's important. Like
Okay,
your
okay.
position on
Yeah, sure. We can go
innovation
into
is
innovation
important.
later, I
Yeah.
guess.
Uh,
Yeah.
so if people, I'm just trying to get to the root of why you have come to your position. I still have like a bit of a question mark on what your position is based on. I'm just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that you have facts and statistics and all the good
Yeah, yeah.
stuff
I mean, I can give you
to
facts and
back up why
statistics.
you think innovation will be sustained under your system. That's my big question,
Yeah,
and
I can
it
give you
touches on
I
the
can give
worker
you
co-op.
facts.
So,
Well,
but
for example,
let
oh,
me
okay,
just move
yeah,
on to
sure.
number three. Number three, if people work harder, should they receive more compensation?
If people work harder, um, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, in general, and that's what you see in worker co-ops. For example, the Mondragon Cooperation, there is a disparity. It's a worker co-op, and there is a disparity in what people make based
Right.
on what they contribute. It's just not as large and as harmful as the disparity that exists in modern capitalist society. I think the rule that they passed is like the top earner cannot earn, like eight or over like 8 or 10 times more than the lowest paid earners. So I mean, these disparities based on what you're contributing still exist,
Right.
but they exist to a more fair extent. Because if you look at how and why these disparities exist under capitalism, you'll have CEOs who are practically doing nothing, who aren't contributing but are earning about like over 300 times more than their workers. So I think that yes, if you go with the argument that people's payment should be based on what they contribute, the logical conclusion of that is that if you're saying that that's something that's moral, the logical conclusion of that is the socialist society that I'm advocating for would be more moral than the capitalist society that we have.
Well, you mentioned fair. You're making the argument, and I think I agree with you, that if people work harder, they should receive more compensation. That would be fair.
Sure.
And you're saying it's unfair in the current situation. If
I'm saying that it'd be
people,
more fair under a socialist society, because under a capitalist society, businesses are intrinsically hierarchical, and
no,
so you
I
have
understand.
people at the top who like aren't doing work but are deciding where all of the surplus goes, and so you have a situation. This is intrinsic to capitalism, not just the crony capitalism that we have. This is intrinsic to the hierarchical nature of capitalism, that you have a situation in which people who are doing less work are getting almost all of the money. So yeah, I
So
think that if you want to
that
accept
brings
that
me to
that's fair, then
my fourth question. If people work smarter, should they receive more compensation?
what do you mean by
How do we
smarter?
reward intelligence? Because this goes back to the innovators.
Okay, yeah. So this does go back to what we were talking about. So I'll use the same example that I would use in that scenario. So I would say, um, uh, if you're in a worker co-op and you come up with an innovation, um, and it will be beneficial to the company, which that's how innovations take place in current capitalist society anyway. Innovations happen if the people who own the company deem it to be beneficial to the company. Um, so if you have an innovation, if you work at a co-op and you have a certain innovation, then and the people who you own the co-op with say, oh, this is a useful innovation, this is going to make profit, then the worker co-op will start producing this innovation and will start doing this innovation. So I don't necessarily think that the innovation slows down. And because disparities in pay based on contribution do still exist in worker co-ops, I could see a scenario in which if you create a certain innovation, you will be compensated more than the other people at the co-op for creating that innovation.
So I can answer yes. If people work smarter, they should receive more compensation. You are in agreement.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Should the compensation be proportional to the value of the innovation?
I don't think that's something that could possibly be measured.
Well, yeah, you
Like
can,
I don't know
because
how that.
like the iPhone was an innovation. The iPhone made Apple X number of dollars. I mean, that's a huge
Right.
innovation.
Yeah.
Somebody came up with it.
So like you're saying like the market value that is accumulated by the production of the innovation. Are you saying that as far as like what you mean by value?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that so you're saying should a certain person be paid based on how much that innovation makes?
Yes. I mean, this is the whole.
Yeah,
that's his capitalism.
I think that's well, I would disagree. So okay. So to answer your first question, yes, I would agree. And I think that under a socialist society, if you're in a cooperative and you make an innovation and it accumulates a lot of money, as I said earlier, there are disparities in pay based on contribution and worker co-ops. And if an innovation is very successful, then that co-op is going to become very profitable, and a disproportionate amount of that profit is going to be likely going to be going to you because you contributed the innovation. And worker co-ops can still have disparities based on contribution. So yeah, no, I don't think that this is necessarily antithetical to. I don't think that this is necessarily antithetical to socialism or thetical to capitalism. And as far as you saying that like this is capitalism, like innovation and compensation based on innovation is capitalism, I would disagree. I would define capitalism in a different way. I guess I generally define capitalism as the hierarchical structure of business. So slave society was characterized by master and slave. Feudal society was characterized by lord and serf, and capitalist society is defined as the power dynamic between the employer and the employee. And I think there's a very good reason to have that be the reasoning for very good reason to have that be the reasoning for how we define capitalism. And that's because if you look at the other major components of capitalism, such as compensation based on exchange, that is a product of markets. Markets existed before capitalism. Markets exist in feudal society and enslaved society.
Why do you bring up
ownership?
Why do you bring up slavery?
Why do I bring up slavery? Oh, because I think that it's comparable in the sense that I would define capitalism just as I would define feudalism or slavery based on the power dynamic between those producing and those extracting the surplus.
You're saying that the power dynamic between slaves and free working people is the same?
No, absolutely not. I wouldn't say that. I'm just saying that I would define both feudalism, slave society, and capitalist society based on the power dynamics. I'm not saying that the power dynamics are the same in these societies.
Well, innovation is often a cycle that improves working conditions. In slave societies, they weren't able to leave their jobs, and therefore that actually stifled innovation. Like it was a huge windfall for innovation doing away with slavery. Like this is one of the reasons why the North won against the South, because the North out-innovated the South, because the South had slavery. There was no need to innovate.
Right. No, I agree. I agree that capitalism is a step up from slave society. I would never disagree with that. Marx would never disagree with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Marx described that capitalism did have a progressive phase in history in which it elevated the standards of living above what they were significantly over feudalism and slave society. I would, however, take slight issue with the claim that it's innovation which intrinsically betters working conditions. If you want to look at the history of the improvement of working conditions in the U.S., it is a history of very violent struggles and unions fighting for the rights of working people to have decent living conditions and so on, and shorter work weeks. So yeah, that's, I guess, but yeah, I wouldn't take issue with the gist of your argument, which is that capitalism is better than slave society and feudal society. It absolutely is. I just think it's not as good as it could be. I think it did have a progressive phase in society in which it elevated standards above those societies, but I think that it is now in a decadent phase in which it is not the best economic system that we can run with.
I'm still curious what you're basing that on. We're in a bit of a side note here. Would like you to explain the power dynamic differential between slave and free worker, because you're saying it's the same power dynamic, but it seems so tangibly different.
No, I'm not saying it's the same power dynamic. It's a completely different power dynamic.
The owner needs the worker as much as the worker needs the owner.
Well, I disagree. No, I disagree with that. I don't think that the worker needs the owner at all. In fact, we've seen the instances.
The slave has no leverage over the master. The worker has leverage.
No. I know. It's a completely different power dynamic. Yeah, I would agree. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Well, then why are you saying it's a similar power dynamic?
No, I'm not saying that it's a similar power dynamic. I mean, it's a similar power dynamic in which a certain group of people are producing and another group of people are extracting the surplus. It is very much a different power dynamic in that a slave could not choose his master, whereas obviously a worker can choose his employer. So it's obviously different in a lot of respects.
Right.
But I was making the comparison to illuminate how my basis for defining capitalism is based on the structure and the relationship between those who produce and those who extract the surplus. That's really all I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's a similar power dynamic. So, but if you wanted to go over,
we're on the finish line.
Okay.
Should compensation be proportional to the value of the innovation? Are you answering yes?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I mean, like, it seems kind of, sure. Okay.
This one's easy. Should the lottery be illegal? Well, if you're worried about, you're saying that you're worried about income inequality disparity. And the reason why people play the lottery is because they want to be rich.
Right.
They want to be richer than everyone else. They want to live in the big house on the hill. It seems like we should make it seems like maybe the lottery being illegal should be step one.
I would disagree that making the lottery illegal is the most viable way to combat income inequality, because I don't think it really addresses the systemic structure of business, which leads to the undemocratic distribution of wealth into so few hands.
So you're okay with the lottery?
I mean, I think that the lottery is pretty dumb. But I mean, I don't think I would ban it. I've never heard an argument for why that should be done.
Well, you're theoretically making an argument that it should be banned if you're worried about people outsized gains.
Well, no, because the lottery, if you look at how much the existence of the lottery contributes to the massive income inequality which we see in society,
it's minute.
It's a drop in the bucket compared to the real systemic issues. And I think it's those systemic issues that breed inequality that need to be addressed.
So I'm curious. This is the last question, by the way. Because I listened to a lot of your debate and you're talking economics, but the guy you were debating wasn't asking you anything about the political system under this economic system, which I'm really curious about. So in this socialist economic system, how are leaders elected? How is the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another? This seems to be the problem that historically socialist governments have had. They tend to fall into these authoritarian regimes. So
yes, yep. I would love to answer this. So, okay, so I would say that under the socialist society that I'm talking about, governance would be the product of the democratic co-determination of the worker co-ops working alongside the democratic body of the community. And these dual democratic bodies, the democratic bodies of the workers and the democratic bodies of the community and the residents of the community the worker co-ops operate within, would sort of co-determine a variety of things. For example, one of the things that they would co-determine is to what extent we want representative democracy or direct democracy. But everything under the governance of this society that I'm envisioning is completely bottom up from the communities and the workplaces, and they co-determine how the government should run, and they have direct recall power over all elected officials. I would completely agree with you that authoritarianism has been a huge issue, which has plagued many socialist experiments. And that's why I'm advocating for a completely different form of completely different form of socialism. the point of having worker co-ops is to create a strong force at the base of society, which can possibly prevent the government from oppressing us in all of the ways that you like to enumerate. So, for example, if you have a society based around worker co-ops, rather than having a tiny group of people who have almost like half of all the wealth and they're cutting deals with the government, we would have a society in which the government is directly dependent on the wages of the everyday people, and the everyday people have much more of a control over the government, and the people in general have much more control over society because they have more wealth.
Well, that's easy to say, but is it like a two-party system? Is it the American system? Is it basically the Constitution?
I would like a constitution, actually. I mean, I do like the idea of a constitution, especially one that grants absolute freedom of speech and so on. That's very important to me. But as far as like the form of governments, I can't really be absolutely sure like how it would be because I'm not really a future teller. But I would like a governing system in which governing takes the form of the co-determination of the democratic bodies of the communities and the workers. And how many parties there would be, I guess, is up to the people who live in this society. It would be up to the workers and the communities, depending on their specific wants and the needs. Because like the issue with like asking me like how many parties there would be is like, most of the parties in modern capitalist society are demonstrated to like how we go about fixing the problems in capitalist society. I don't know what specific problems may exist or may need addressing in a socialist society, so I can't really tell you like which parties there would be. But yeah, that's my general idea on governing is co-determination.
I live under the assumption that one-party systems are evil.
They're
the worst system going, because no matter what the structure of society is, there's always going to be problems to solve. And if you're solving them in a one-party system, that's
I agree. Listen, I'm not a big like intellectual dark web person, but I have listened to a fair amount of talking from the intellectual dark web. And I think that if there's one point that they're absolutely correct on, it's that a variety of ideas and so on is very important for a flourishing society. So yeah, I would completely agree. I'm against one party system.
And hasn't the one party system really been the problem with the socialist experiments in the 20th century? Like a regime comes to power offering socialism to the people, which sounds good. You know, they're going to deal with income inequality by taking from the wealthy, who in my estimation are the producers, the innovators, and equally distributing it throughout society. But something happens during the revolution, and all of a sudden we're in a one-party system, and they, instead of distribute like it always short circuit where they always take the money from the rich people, but then somehow it ends up in their pockets and not redistributed to the society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would completely agree with you there. Well, for one, I would just like to say that, and this isn't a defense of those nations, but I would say in large part the reason a lot of these nations have evolved into authoritarianism is due to the fact that most everywhere where a country or nation attempts socialism, that place is met with large amounts of foreign intervention from imperialist powers. So, for example, the USSR, it was not in existence for a long time before the US and other nations started attacking it and trying to intervene in it. The same goes for Chile, and Venezuela and Afghanistan and a lot of these other experiments. And I think that sort of innovation has distorting effects on a society and can lead to a society being more authoritarian because the people become more anxious that they're being threatened by all of these external threats, and they need a strong man who can organize things. And the government feels like, oh, there's all of these people trying to interfere. We have to crack down on our people to make sure none of them are spies and so on. So I do think intervention has been a big issue in causing many of these socialist societies to become authoritarian. But I would completely agree that a lot of the mistakes that a lot of these socialist societies make, what I would say are the mistakes are they are essentially state capitalist in that they didn't destroy the power dynamic, the hierarchical power dynamic between the employer and the employee. They just replaced the employer with state officials, and I think that's a big issue. And so I would completely agree that having the state, take over and start to do everything is a bad idea. And that's why I have learned from those societies' failures and am advocating for something different, which could prevent that sort of fallout that we've seen in these other experiments.
So why didn't they abolish the old system? My argument would be that they really couldn't, because now that they have the reins of power and the means of production, I would argue that changing the system in the way that you want to change the system would directly threaten their power, because they would no longer be producing, which would be devastating for everyone. And this is kind of the situation that had happened in like Maoist China and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a danger. And that's why I don't advocate for this situation in which we create a massive authoritarian government, which then creates socialism. I mean, I do agree, I do advocate for political advocacy for worker self-directed enterprises. But no, I'm not like I'm not in favor of creating like a dictatorship or like a massive state to, enforce socialism. I think they had the wrong idea of socialism. Again, I think that they replaced employers with state officials, but didn't get rid of the hierarchical structure, which carries all of these contradictions, which plague a capitalist society.
So I think we're in agreement in the socialists offer people the same thing that you're offering people, a more equitable society. They take over through revolution. They seize the means of production. And where they always fall down is by abolishing the hierarchical system and implementing something like worker co-ops. Now, do we know that they they falter there because they don't try? They're greedy. It's impossible, perhaps. Why
It's impossible to do what?
It's impossible to abolish the standard hierarchical means of production in favor of a co-op system without destroying the companies. Why is that the fault point?
Oh, wait. So you're saying that, so the reason that a lot of these nations never converted to like a worker co-op style socialist society is because that was never their objective, right? Like their idea was planned economies, which I'm not advocating for that.
So they never,
they never intended to create a society in which workers own their own enterprises. They intended to create a society in which enterprise didn't exist because there was a single planner of all economic activity.
Okay.
And I think that's a lot of the issue. I think a lot of the issue is also, again, foreign intervention, the embargoes, which are placed on pretty much every nation that attempts socialism, the sanctions, the direct military interference. I think there's a lot of factors, yeah. But I think what you're getting at is you're saying like, how could you advocate for socialism when it's failed so many times? But what I would remind you is that capitalism did not emerge out of feudalism all at once or without any failures. Capitalism failed numerous times as it emerged out of socialism before becoming the dominant economic structure, as did feudalism did when it was coming out of slave society. If you want some examples of this, there are northern Italian city-states, there were Portuguese colonies, etc. And so you saying like socialism has failed before becoming the economically dominant system. It's like, yeah, but that's just the standard for economic systems. This is not specific to or a critique of socialism. Yeah.
So, but we learn from those failures of capitalism, I'll assume.
Absolutely.
And I'm just saying, hey, we've had some failures of socialism. Maybe we could learn something here.
Yeah. No, I would agree.
My open question is, and just for the people listening, state capitalism is often called when the revolutionaries come in and seize the means of production, they want a worker co-op system. Marx was for this, right? Marx was in favor of the worker co-op system. Where's the worker co-op system come from then, if it doesn't come from Marx?
Well, it's kind of like an old tradition. I guess I don't
So
actually know
so
where it's
okay,
originated from. That's a good question. I guess
let's
Richard Wolff is like the foremost
right.
advocate of it at this moment.
So these revolutionaries come in, they seize the means of production by offering to make society more fair and equitable, and somehow they don't the spoils that they take in the revolution never seem to filter down to the people, and it becomes a one party system. My question is, if even if a person comes in with the best of intentions and tries to implement this top down system of cooperatives, or however you want to structure to get rid of the hierarchy, perhaps that is impossible. Perhaps it is physically impossible for them to do. And that's where the breakdown occurs.
No, I disagree. I think that we have a plethora of real world examples showing that not only are creating democratically owned workplaces possible, but extremely efficient. I think we see that in the Mondragon cooperation. I think we have a plethora of data suggesting this. And I guess this gets back to your earlier question, like what data are you representing or are you basing your worldview? And I could present some of this data for you if you want. I would be happy to. For example, one thing I like to bring up a lot is a meta-analysis which was conducted by Professor Eric Olson at the University of Missouri in 2013, found that the consensus of the existing literature, he looked over several studies, is that once created, worker co-ops have survival rates which meet or possibly even exceed that of traditional businesses. If you want an even more massive meta-analysis,
Possibly.
one done by Professor Douglas Cruz of over 70 studies on worker co-ops found that worker co-ops have higher productivity, more stability, more growth, better firm performance, and higher survival rates. And the workers who work there are compensated more in wages, are more satisfied with their lives. So I do think that there is a large body of empirical data suggesting that this is a viable way to build an economy.
Okay. There's obviously people will say, then why aren't they out competing traditional
Yeah,
businesses? So
I mean, I can go over that. For example, Eric Olson brought up some reason of why there aren't more worker co-ops. For example, one thing that he stated was workers must take the risk of high costs should the enterprise fail, since in most cases they must make an initial contribution to the business. And in addition to losing their jobs, they would also lose this investment. And this risk of loss may make taking a job in a conventional business more appealing. Relatedly, these startups are usually credit constrained and lack collateral. Co-ops do not typically offer control to outside investors and rely heavily on loans, which can be hard to come by, or their own limited wealth. Also, startups may be unevenly distributed, and the founders of the co-op may not see a material benefit for the risks they took in starting the business. So these are all very structural barriers which exist in the modern economy to the creation of worker co-ops, which is why worker co-ops do have lower startup rates. But we see that once they have been started up, their survival rates are even higher than that of traditional businesses, and they're more productive and they're more successful, and the workers are happier there.
the problem is the low starter rates, correct? You're saying that once
Yeah.
they get going, they're great, but not many people are incentivized to start them.
Yes, because the modern capitalist economy does not really incentivize worker co-ops. And so, like, yeah, for example,
Why doesn't it incentivize worker co-ops?
well, I just went over some of the reasons. So, for example, most people aren't really well off. And so, if you're going to start a worker co op, you must take the risk of high costs if the enterprise were to fail. And since in most cases, you must make an initial contribution to the co op, if
So it's
that
high
company
high
were to
risk, you're
fail, in
saying.
addition to losing your job, you would also lose the investment. And this risk of loss may make taking a job in a conventional business more appealing. And so one of these structural barriers that we see is that people aren't very well off. And that's because our modern capitalist economy distributes wealth so unequally. It's also harder to attract investors because in a co-op, it's very hard to give investors control over the company because, obviously it's a co-op. So yeah, there are a variety of structural economic barriers in ways in which the economic superstructure of capitalism impedes the creation and the prominency of worker co-ops.
So it's high risk and low reward because you like you said, like you're not going to get an outsized gain. It's the exact opposite incentives of playing the lottery.
The risk is higher than taking a job in a conventional business, because if you are a worker in a conventional business, you just take the business, and if the business fails, you lose your job.
Yeah,
if you're a worker in a worker co-op, if that
risk.
business fails, then you lose an investment. Huh?
That's called low risk.
Yes.
If the business fails, you just lose your job. The risk is high for the business owner who is putting everything on the line. You're asking more people.
The risk is lower to be a worker in a conventional business than it is to be in a than it is to be in a worker co-op. And so the issue is that's not a product of the inefficiency of co-ops. That's not a product of co-ops not being a viable way in which we could build a more equitable and sustainable economy. This is an argument as to how the current economic superstructure of capitalism sort of disincentivizes the creation of worker co-ops. And there's a lot of ways we could combat this. We could lower the risk by making people...
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, but you're talking about basically giving co-ops, like babying them, because
things like preferential loans. Well, hold on.
Well, how's that not babying them?
Hold on, because if you're going to use this argument against socialism, a feudalist could have used this exact same argument of capitalism as capitalism was emerging out of feudalism. Because if you're not familiar with the history of capitalism's emergence out of feudalism, as capitalist enterprises were starting to start up, and as capitalist enterprises became more common, they started forming political advocacy groups to benefit capitalists over feudalists, because they were saying, oh, we're being taxed,
but they raised the capital. They raised the capital themselves as business owners to promote that advocacy, to sustain that advocacy. So it wasn't a babying situation. They weren't saying...
Well, they were using their existing wealth to advocate and form political parties, and allow the government to...
Where did that wealth come from? Came from the merchant class.
Creating that wealth. Yeah.
Yeah. Without any babying, with the whole political system working against them.
But it would be the same thing with co-ops, because with a co-op, it's, hey, we are a co-op, and we're maybe a federation of co-ops, and we have accumulated all of this money from co-ops, and now we are going to do political advocacy because the current economic system disincentivizes the creation of co-ops, and we want the creation of more co-ops. So we are going to invest some of our money into political advocacy so that the powers that exist help to make co-ops more prominent. That's exactly what
that would be
out of feudalism.
But the difference is you're having to put the political advocacy before you have the resources to sustain the political advocacy, and I would argue it's because co-ops are painfully inefficient. They don't raise enough money for surplus money for political advocacy.
Oh, well, I mean, I would disagree with that. I mean, the co-ops absolutely earn enough profit to do this. It's just this hasn't been done because of a lack of class consciousness. So I think you've kind of shifted the argument, because now we're not talking about whether or not it's babying for them to encourage political advocacy for their kinds of enterprises, which is exactly what capitalists did. Now we're talking about whether or not they earn enough money to do this, and that's fine. We can talk about that. For example, a study by Douglas Cruz found that worker co-ops are actually more profitable. It was a meta-analysis of over 70 studies. For example, we can look at the Mondragon Corporation, which is a lot more profitable and big and innovative than a lot of capitalist enterprises. So no, I would reject the idea that co-ops just don't raise enough money to help themselves get political advocacy. I mean, one of the person who's advocating this political advocacy and talking about starting this party is Richard Wolff, who raised his money from co-ops.
Okay, not Richard Wolff is not a billionaire by any means. I know Richard Wolff.
He's not.
I've done videos on Richard Wolff. So, you've been very kind with your time and you've answered all my questions. If you have questions for me, I have a few things that I pulled out of the debate that I'd like to discuss, but I'll let you have the floor if you want to lay out any arguments that we haven't covered already.
I
mean, honestly, it sounds like you could steelman my argument, and I'm positive I could steelman your argument. So,
yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't. I just honestly, I didn't really come prepared with like questions to ask, so I'm not really sure. Like, I apologize, but I'm not really sure what questions I would really ask, or like what necessarily arguments we haven't really gone over that we should talk about.
Well, there is a moral issue that I'm interested in, because I think in your other debate, you were making the argument that it's immoral to force people to work low-wage jobs, and you've kind of backpedaled a little bit here on slavery versus wage.
I mean, it wasn't a backpedal. That's always been my position. Right. Of course, I would never say that the dynamic between slaves and capitalists is the same dynamic as the dynamic between, or slaves and masters is the same dynamic as the dynamic between workers and capitalists. That was never the point that I made, or that's never a point I would make. I was simply drawing the comparison to show how I define modes of production based on the structure of production. But yeah, that's a minor point.
Richard Wolff defines surplus, like he's a labor theory of value guy. He talks about the surplus value that you create in a job is ripping you off. He specifically uses that term, ripping you off.
Absolutely.
Which makes me think that it's immoral or unfair to structure a business in that way.
Well, I mean, so if you want to go over like the whole like surplus value thing, we can absolutely do that. So the basic argument for surplus value is the argument that every time you work for a company, you are producing less than what you are going to be compensated for what you're producing. And that is because a business's sole drive is profit, and they're not going to be making any profit off of you if they're paying you as much or more than you are producing. So of course it's going to be in their interest to compensate you for less than what you're producing. So in a sense, yeah, you are kind of being ripped off because you are inherently producing more than you're being compensated for. And that's the whole surplus value argument.
Right. I mean, it seems like there's I heard you in your other debate argue that people aren't, because this goes back to the innovation argument. A lot of people will make the argument that, and I've made the argument here, that without the outsized gains, people won't innovate. And you've made the argument that people will continue to innovate, even if they know, I think Vosh was saying, if your company goes to 3 employees, then the company would become a co-op and you'd have to split.
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit. Could you like restate what you're saying?
Sure. Vosh was saying that companies will become co-ops at over 3 employees. Just, I don't know if that's a sustainable thing in Marxist. I don't know when the co-op thing comes into play, but the argument that many people will say is that without the outsized gains of owning a business and developing a business and controlling a business, that people will no longer innovate. The incentive to innovate will be gone.
Yeah, I just fundamentally disagree with that. And I know that you're all about about data, so I can provide you some data with this. For example, I would bring up the fact that recently a Harvard Business Review study found that for patent-protected for-profit innovations are increasingly being outcompeted in many parts of the economy by consumer-created innovations, by which come from the hands of consumers who give these innovations out and distribute them for free. I also think a very large variety of, or a very large percentage of the innovations in our current economy are the result of government innovation. I mean, look at the two most profound innovations in possibly history, which most innovations like from those like Elon Musk are born out of: the digital computer and the internet. These innovations were not born from profit-driven competition. They were born from cooperation between scientists and given to us from the public sector. I mean, this can be seen in other areas as well. For example, the private sector spends much more on medical research and development, yet 3 out of the 4 breakthrough medicines in the US are developed by the publicly funded National Institute of Health. So yeah, I just kind of reject this idea that like we need profit for innovation. But even if we did need profit for innovation, there are still profits to be made in a worker co-op system. And you can still even earn a disproportionate amount of money from contributing an innovation to a co-op, because there are still disparities in pay within co-ops.
So you're saying that if we don't, because in your system there won't be outsized gains, correct? You won't the incentive to start a business that's going to be turned over to your employees at 3 employees is not there. But you're saying humans will still continue to do this because they're altruistic. Is that your argument?
I don't know. You mean people wouldn't have the incentive to create worker co-ops? I mean,
yes,
they don't have the incentive to create worker co-ops right now because of the economic superstructure of capitalism.
Well, what is the
but
incentive
that's why
to create?
I advocate for.
What is the incentive to why do people start a restaurant or create a business? What is the incentive for them to do that? It's the outsized gain, right?
It depends. Yeah, sometimes
for the same reason they play the lottery.
Still exist in a co-op. Huh? Yeah.
People start businesses for the same reason they play the lottery.
A lot of people create businesses just because they want to have a business and they want to participate in that process. But yeah, even if I were to grant you that all business making is because of the profit motive would still exist in a worker co-op. Like there would still be profits to be made in a worker co-op. And yes, many people are disincentivized from creating worker co-ops within the context of the current economic superstructure. But that's why we advocate for political advocacy to change that superstructure and get rid of some of the disincentives and credit constraints and systemic barriers that exists right now, so that more worker co-ops can be created and we can transition to a more equitable and sustainable economy. Outsized
gains are off the table, though, correct?
What do you mean by outsized gains?
If I start a car company, I'm not going to get the kind of lottery type winning gains that I would. I'll be shouldering a lot of risk, but I'm not going to get the gains. Correct? High risk, low reward?
No, you will still get gains. And it's high risk within the context of the current economic superstructure, but a lot of the point of politically advocating for what?
There's not going to be Jeff Bezos. There's not going to be Bill
That's
Gates.
True, and thank God there will be no Jeff Bezos.
Okay.
Because people who have that amount of money, it's just disruptive. Like I just don't see the point in it.
Okay, but Jeff Bezos is like a huge innovator. Bill Gates is a huge innovator.
Yeah, I just disagree with the idea that we need these people to innovate, because for every one innovator who accumulates all this money, they could have innovated without having nearly that much money. And also them having that much money takes away the amount of money that millions of working people could have and that they could then use to innovate themselves,
all that
they don't,
aside,
because they don't really have the financial means to do so.
All that aside, don't you think the greed is really what's motivating these people to innovate? Don't you think greed drives a lot of this innovation?
I don't think it's that two-dimensional. I think that there is a lot of things which contribute to innovation. I mean, as I just explained, a Harvard Business Review study recently found that for-profit innovations are increasingly being outcompeted by innovations which come from consumers who give them away
Well,
for
but
free. So I would deny that it is like it's intrinsic greed, which is the only thing that
it's
causes.
not an all or nothing situation though, because
I
human
agree.
nature is not all or nothing. You can have a
No,
society
yeah,
where
yeah,
20% of the people are greedy and 80% of the people are selfless. And if 50% of the
absolutely.
innovation comes from the 20% that are greedy, and 50% of the innovation comes from the 20% of the people that are selfless, if you get rid of the incentives for the greedy people, you're still going to lose 50% of your innovation. And that's my question is, can society
Mm.
survive on
No,
50% of its innovation?
no, I disagree with that. I think that if some people are encapsulated, I think it is somewhat of a zero-sum game, which incentives have influence, or at least to an extent it is. Because I think that if you have an economy in which a lot of innovations are coming from greed and some are coming from selflessness, I think that that means that culturally there is a very prominent cultural incentive for greed. But I think once that cultural incentive for greed goes away, you are going to see more people being selfless. Because yes, greed is a prominent incentive, but it is an incentive which downplays and suppresses other incentives. And in the absence of this incentive, it will no longer be suppressing the other incentives. And the other incentives, like selflessness, will have the ability to flourish more. Let me give you an example, because I think you're sort of painting a kind of concrete view of like this static
So
human nature that I don't really agree with.
you're saying
So
greed, your system doesn't involve greed, correct?
no, there's still a profit motive. But let me like break something down, because I think that this is a crucial misunderstanding. I think you're kind of painting this like concrete, static view of human nature, whereas I think human nature is a lot more fluid. And if you've ever read, I would look into reading it. It's a great book. A book by an evolutionary biologist and anarchist called Pyotr Kropotkin, who wrote a book called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, in which he historically documented the evolution in humanity and found that there have been countless societies in which the societies were built around the ethic of mutual aid, helping each other out, sort of like collectivism, altruism, rather than this like social Darwinist survival of the fittest greed. And when societies have built their societies around this ethic, they develop more. We can see this in many periods in Europe in the 1800s, in medieval societies. We see that places like innovate and develop and are more successful when they adopt this ethic of altruism. So I don't agree with your characterization that like we're just greedy, and if you get rid of the greed, then our ability to innovate goes away. And even if that were true, that still wouldn't make the case against socialism, because there is still a profit motive.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's like a contradiction here, because you're essentially arguing in the cases of Richard Wolff that, you know, if you're not getting paid your exact amount of value that you're producing in products, you're getting ripped off, which is like inherently a greed argument. And at the same time,
No.
you're saying people are going to be altruistic. Why don't you just tell the people? Why doesn't Richard Wolff just tell the people they're not, to be selfless and not worry about?
No, well, I think there's two issues with that argument. For one, saying that people or saying that there is greedy things which are going on in a capitalist society. Sorry, my chair is kind of squeaking. Saying that there are greedy things which go on in a capitalist society and people act in greedy ways within the context of the capitalist society is not antithetical to the claim that we have the capacity and that it would be more beneficial if we structured our society in a more altruistic way. Because the whole argument would be, yes, people are acting greedy in the capitalist economy, and that's because the economy and the superstructure incentivizes greed. But if we structured our economy and our society in a different way, we would have the capacity to be more altruistic, and this would be beneficial. Also, we're not arguing
wouldn't the socialist society still like have the problem of greed?
I
mean, I
sure.
would argue that the reason
sure
these companies are less, I would argue that the reason these companies are less efficient is because the greed is just shifted down to the individual people, where their greed is to maintain their jobs and make as much money as they can for as little effort. So therefore, innovation is ultimately stifled because obviously they're always going to vote in favor of keeping their jobs over spending money on innovation.
No, I disagree with that. So for one thing, okay, sorry, I'm just trying to think back to the first thing that you just said. So the first, what was the first thing that you said? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm saying that the problem of greed is still existent. Like my understanding is greed, like capitalism harnesses greed for innovation. Socialism harnesses greed, like pushes the greed down to the individual, and it stifles innovation because you give these individual people effectively too much power.
Okay, sorry, I'm just writing down your points because there's a few.
I should read this super chat to a very dead horse for $1.09. I was very nice to contribute to super chat, and he says excess wealth is the engine of innovation. Ask Elon, which is basically the argument that I'm making here. That you want to get rid of the excess wealth, but I'm making the argument that you're going to lose at least. I mean, this 80-20 thought experiment that I've laid out, I would say you're going to lose more than 50% of your innovation. I would say this is why the socialist countries fall apart, is because they lose 90% of their innovation. No one is incentivized to innovate because they're not going to get, for the same reason people play the lottery, they start businesses. They want those outside gains, and even if it falls apart, it creates economic activity.
Okay, so there's a few arguments to go over here. So the first argument you made was that greed will still exist under socialism. I agree. Greed will probably exist to some extent or another in almost any economic system because it is a tendency of human nature, though how much that tendency is actualized is very much dependent on the environment, which would be my whole point, is that yes, greed may still exist, but if we change the way the economy is structured, it may not be exist or be actualized to the same extent, and that is an important qualification to make. Also, co-ops, you say co-ops have no incentive to innovate. I mean, again, I would disagree. I disagree with the premise that innovation comes exclusively from the profit motive. We have evidence that when you create a society based more so around mutual aid, then you see more innovation, more development. You see innovation from the public sector and from consumers who give them away quite a bit. Almost, I would say the majority of our innovation. Again, Elon Musk and them, they create innovations based on the innovations of the computer and the internet, which both come from scientists cooperating in publicly funded research. And so I think that if you get rid of some of the greed, then the other incentives which exist to incentivize innovation will become more prominent because you no longer have the incentive of greed sort of suppressing these other motives. And even if I were to grant your every premise, profit still exists in a socialist society. Profit is still something that exists. It is still in your self-interest to create an innovation, because if you're a worker co-op if you're working for a worker co-op and you create an innovation and it brings that company a lot of profit, you're likely getting a disproportionate amount of that profit relative to your other workers, because we see in a lot of worker co-ops that compensation is based on contribution. And so, yes, you still do get a lot more money than you would get if you hadn't made the innovation. So there's still the incentive to do innovations, even if I were to grant your every premise about greed being a necessity and so on.
Well, it seems like a contradiction, because you're essentially arguing workers should have a larger share of their own productivity. At the same time, you're arguing that people aren't inherently greedy. Do you not see that contradiction?
No, I don't. What do you mean?
Well, you're here advocating that individuals should receive a larger portion of their own productivity, correct?
Yep.
Why should they receive a larger portion of their productivity? Why do they want to receive
Because
a larger portion of their productivity?
I think you're equivocating between greed and self-interest.
I thought greed and self-interest were the same thing.
Not really. I mean, I guess maybe. I'm not saying that I'm empirically right on the linguistics here, but maybe we just are operating on different definitions. But
we talked about selflessness in opposition to greed in my thought experiment. So I would assume we're talking about self-interest.
Well, I would say greed is more so self-interest at the expense of others, whereas self-interest is, just self-interest. So I would say that they have different sorts of connotations and implications. But I would say that sorry, I'm trying to to remember what point you were originally making. Oh man, what was the point you were originally making?
Essentially,
before you got wrapped up in the linguistics.
Essentially, and this can be our last point, unless you have anything more. But
yeah, I have to go relatively soon.
I feel like a lot of people who are advocating for socialism or communism, that you're forcing. Your argument is basically forcing people to work low wage jobs is immoral, right?
I do think that is immoral.
Yeah, people are put in a situation where they don't have any alternative. This is a form of exploitation. People like Richard Wolff have equated it to slavery. He often calls it wage slavery. So, but at the same time, if you're working in a situation in your system where the company is less productive, your portion, even if you're getting an equal portion of the productivity, can be much smaller than in a company that's much more efficient than your situation, and your portion is much smaller.
I'm sorry, restate that point again. You cut out a little bit.
I'm saying that in your scenario, in your situation where you have a company that has X productivity, and the worker is given an even split of that productivity. First of all, I don't know where the innovation comes from, where the innovation budget comes from in that company. But if you're working for an innovative company,
produce a surplus.
If you're working for an innovative company that is much more productive, and you're getting a much smaller share of that of the productivity you yourself are producing, but it ends up being more side to side with the less productive company that you could work for, people will want to work for that company where they're getting paid less and producing more, because it's a net gain.
Yeah. Well, okay, no. So a worker co-op will still have to produce more than they pay their workers' wages, right? I don't think that that's something that any Marxist even disagrees with. The Marxist view, which Karl Marx laid out in Wage, Labor, and Capital, is that profit can really only come from the extraction of the surplus value, which is extracted from the labor of the worker. The argument that Marxists like I and Richard Wolff make is not that extraction of surplus value shouldn't exist, because it still would, and that would still be the source for innovations and so on. The argument is that somebody who is a hierarchical business owner who should not have control over this distribution of the surplus, which everybody else helps to create. So, So that is the argument. Also, I wanted to get back to something that you said I never got to address about there being a contradiction between people having more autonomy and saying that people shouldn't operate in their self-interest or whatever. Because I think that there's a misunderstanding there that I think it's crucial that we sift through or parse through. So self-interest still would exist. Everybody has self-interest, and I think it's within everybody's right to act within their self-interest. The critique that I and Richard Wolff and others levy at capitalism is that oftentimes people are able to pursue their self-interest in ways which are very detrimental to society and which are unjust. So I guess to just clarify that point, but I do have to go relatively soon. So
what is
I don't know if we can.
What is the point of unjust? And we can wrap it up here.
The point of unjust? I think it is.
You said greed is basically unjust. People operate in their own self-interest in ways that become unjust. I mean, part of the
yes.
The point of capitalism is to harness people's greed to do things that are for the benefit of society. Like rent seeking is obviously bad. I think we would agree there, but innovation is what our economy more and more is based on.
No, so I think that
we can let it go.
The ways in which
I know you have to go, so we can let it go.
Yeah, I guess just to throw out this last point, I think that the ways in which many capitalists pursue their self-interest are detrimental to humanity, and I know that. So I would say, for example, climate change is an example of that. It is something which was detrimental to society, yet it was pursued anyways because it was in people's self-interest, and the mass of people who this didn't benefit didn't really have a democratic stake in which didn't have a democratic stake in whether these polluting technologies and practices were pursued or not. And now I know you're going to say, well, people like Elon Musk are kind of
innovation is going to solve this problem.
Yeah, but climate change has killed many people. You can never make the argument that it was overall beneficial, but it was still pursued by profit.
Who died
people
from climate
seeking
change?
Their profit. Huh?
Who died from climate change?
Well, many scientists linked some of the
storms,
the exacerbation of like recent hurricanes to climate change, and many people died from that.
Gotcha. Here lies Joey, killed by climate change.
All right. Well, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, this was an interesting discussion.
Yeah,
this was an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
So
I would love to talk to you some other time if you're interested.
Yeah, let's do it. But, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
I'll put a link to your channel in the description below too. Remind me or hit me up if I don't do it. Yeah, take care.
All right, you too.
So I have another super